Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
Gabby, I didn't ever think I'd ask you this question, just because of the nature of it is very technical. But do you have an accountant?
I do not personally have an account. I wish that I was taught more about finance. It's one of those adult things where you start to make money and then try to figure out what's the best way to manage it. I do have somebody that helps us with our taxes every year because my husband's self-employed and it can get
a little dicey, a little messy, complicated with all of that stuff.
But no, I don't have. Do you?
No, I do not have an accountant. Probably, again, I wish I had learned more about finance when I was younger as well. But, it is what it is, and now I'm just rolling with it.
Sometimes I go to you for my financial questions, to be honest.
Thank you. Yeah, I try to think a lot about financial stuff.
How much of my paycheck should I be putting in my 401k?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
We have talked about that before.
We have.
So, yeah.
Anyways.
We won't get into it, but it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
So.
It turns out, though, New Mexico in general is actually hurting for accountants. And while you may think, okay, there are plenty of industries that need staff, this particular industry, interestingly enough, has the capacity to impact local economies in a way that you might not have thought of.
Yeah, and let's introduce our guest here today, who's certainly an expert in the field. He's also an elected official in charge of overseeing a unique New Mexico office aimed at holding New Mexico's local governments accountable, mainly through accounting. That is New Mexico State Auditor Joseph Maestas, who joins us now. Auditor Maestas, thanks for being here.
Glad to be with you, and thank you for the invitation to have our conversation about a number of topics.
Yeah, appreciate it. As we mentioned, you are an elected official. You're a Democrat. You won the office for first term, as I understand, November 2022. You have an engineering background, having served as the chair and vice chair of the Public Regulation Commission before that changed up through statute or through the state constitution. You've also been a city councilor in Santa Fe and Espanola, as I understand. But let's talk a little bit more about your background. What brought you to the position of becoming the state auditor?
Sure. Well, I'm a native New Mexican. I was born and raised in Santa Fe County. Born in Santa Fe, raised in Santa Cruz. I come from a big family, a family of military veterans and school teachers. I was raised on a small farm, so I raised animals and tended to summer gardens. We had a family business to run, so there was never a lack of things to do growing up. My father was a science teacher as well, and actually I had him for 7th grade science. But I think it was his influence that really got me into math and science, and I think that opened the door for me to pursue degrees in engineering. I've got a bachelor's and master's in engineering. I'm also a professional engineer. I'm licensed in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. So I like to think of myself as more of a pragmatic problem solver. And, when I decided to pursue politics, I was living in Espanola, and at that time I really felt the government was unethical and entrenched. And it's just that question that you ask yourself, are you just going to sit on the couch and complain, or are you going to do something about it? So I decided to run for city council in Espanola. And I won. I decided that my mission was to pursue good government. And the first action I took as a baby counselor was the mayor at the time won a bid for a tractor. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, all the staff are recommending to me that I concur in this award for a bid to the mayor. He was going to recuse, but, I just raised my hand and I said, the appearance does not look right. I'm not implying that anything nefarious has happened. And the mayor ended up retracting the bid. And so it was at that moment, my first official action as a baby counselor was that I want to champion an accountable and transparent government. And so that kind of paved the way for me to pursue a political career. I've dedicated my whole life to public service. On my professional side, I worked for the federal government in civil service for over 30 years. let's see, I think I'm at 18 years as an elected official, 14 as a municipal elected official. I also served as mayor of Espanola after serving for 6 years as a councilman. And so, God, I don't want to count all the years that I've been in public service if you add, political and professional. But as you mentioned, I also served on the Santa Fe City Council for 4 years and on the PRC for 2. And I've been 2 years into my first term. So, public service isn't for everyone, but to me, it's very gratifying to help people, be in a position to be a voice for the voiceless. Now, I know that there's a lot of distasteful aspects about politics, but I don't allow myself to be consumed by it. I figure it's just incidental to it, and I treat it as such, and I really focus on being a voice, helping people, and making government responsive to the people.
Yeah. And for those who may not know exactly what you do as state auditor, can you tell us about how you see your role in this position? What
Sure.
is it you do, and who do you audit exactly?
Sure. Yeah, well, the Office of the State Auditor is one of 7 agencies in the executive branch. But people think that we're like a cabinet department under the governor's purview and authority, and that is not the case. We are nonpartisan, we're independent, and we're enabled by the state's constitution. So, and it's ironic because I'm the great-grandson of a constitutional delegate. He voted yes on the Constitution. He was a Republican. His name was Jose Amado Lucero. So it's kind of ironic that a great-grandson of a constitutional delegate is holding a constitutional office. So to me, that lineage and this role is very serious, and I take it serious. So one of 7 executive agencies, what we do is we oversee the financial affairs of every single public entity in the state of New Mexico. And it's not just local governments, it's higher ed institutions, it's school districts, it's small local public bodies, your acequias, your land grants, your mutual domestic and water associations. So it's a big job. And so I see myself as the financial watchdog for public funds in the state of New Mexico. But beyond the title, we oversee the audit of all these public entities. My office also has the authority to conduct fraud examinations and special audits. We also regulate independent public accounting firms. We don't have the resources like other states to directly conduct all these audits of over 600 entities. So what we do is we vet independent public accounting firms, and then we approve them every year. And once we approve them, then that's the green light for them to fan out and contract with public entities all across the state to conduct annual financial compliance audits. So we regulate the public accounting industry, so to speak. And the last thing that we've been doing since 2021, which is a vast departure of the historical function of the office, and that is the state legislature passed a bill in 2021 requiring us to review and potentially audit annual financial reports of conservatorships. A conservatorship, there's vulnerable adults out there that can't manage their financial assets, so they hire a conservator, and this is all done through the courts. So in that function, we're dealing with private financial information, which prior to 2021, we had only dealt with public financial information. So this is a new task. It's maybe detracted, I think, from the core mission of overseeing the audit of public entities and working with public financial information. And we've had to exercise my power to subpoena. My office has subpoena power. We've never had to do it on the public financial side because there's a lot of other statutes that really compel them to provide information that we request. But in the case of conservatorships and specific conservatorships that we choose to audit, these private financial institutions are not as forthcoming. And so we've issued probably about 15, just under 15 subpoenas to get this financial information. And the way it works is we get about 1,600 conservatorship annual reports. We have to review them within a certain time period. And then depending on our analysis, our risk analysis, we make a determination whether or not we should audit them. And so Here's a very different role, and again, it's very non-traditional compared to what this office has done in the past. So it's a big job. And the other thing, too, is that we handle all intake of anonymous fraud, waste, and abuse complaints. We get about one a day. On the average, 2 out of every 3 are actionable. And when we see a fraud examination to a conclusion, it concludes in a referral. And we typically refer it to the district attorney in that locale, but we also make other referrals to law enforcement, either state police or local city police. We've made referrals to the State Ethics Commission since its creation. We also make referrals to management. If this particular fraud examination requires that management in a particular state agency or government will refer it to management. So you can see it's what we do is quite diverse and very important, and we do it on a shoestring budget. I like to say that we're small but mighty. Our staff, fully staffed, we have about 42, but right now our vacancy rate's about 25%, so we have about 32 employees. So it's a big job. It's a big job.
Yeah, and just what you're describing there from, and I don't know if I'm going to hit all of them, but doing audits of local governments to reports, investigating reports of fraud, waste, and abuse, to even now this conservatorship review stuff. It goes to show you just a vast array of review that y'all are responsible for. And we mentioned that, people in New Mexico are really needed for that profession to help fulfill the obligations of this office. That is accounting to some extent. If we can start there, how big is that need in New Mexico for people to get into this profession of accounting and helping with that audit practice? And really, why is it needed to fulfill this role?
Well, I'm a pragmatist, and so I never say that the sky is falling unnecessarily. But in the case of this talent shortage in the field of accounting, we have a full-blown workforce crisis. Not just here in New Mexico, but across the country. We're seeing a major flood of retirements by your baby boomers that hold CPAs. We have college students that have a lot of misconceptions about the field of accounting. They see it as boring and underpaid and overworked. Higher education is really not promoting the field of accounting. With the advent of all these technologies that have great potential to be applied in the field of accounting, like AI, blockchain learning, machine learning, data analytics. And so I think it's time for us to reframe and repackage the field of accounting, again, with the advent of these technologies, but we need the assistance of higher ed to really kind of change and spruce up their curriculum. So this is not something that I solely can do. It's going to take a lot of partners. It's going to take the legislature to perhaps consider changing the requirements for a CPA to make it more attractive for especially people of color. And I'll go into some of the requirements that I think are an impediment to pursuing a CPA, but I think it's incumbent upon me as the state auditor to really be the voice and sound the alarm that we have a workforce crisis here. And it's not just in the context of what my office does. Look at what the field of accounting does to private corporations, to making investment decisions. There's a whole host of functions that an accountant plays in a free market economy. And I don't think we can continue with a flourishing free market economy in the absence of a sufficient number of accountants.
Mm-hmm. I understand, there's definitely a demand for this career. The supply of professionals doesn't seem to be there. You mentioned boomers are retiring. Young people might not be as interested. We had a conversation with your office, before this podcast where you all mentioned there's sort of a new recruiting method to try and get young people in STEM moving into accounting from like the business college. This is a federal proposal to shift to the science and technology department. What's the idea behind that?
Well, the idea, and first, it's being spearheaded by the principal national organization that represents the interests of the accounting industry, and that's the American Institute of CPAs. And so they sent a letter in May, and there's there's pending legislation on both the House side and the Senate side in D.C. To basically include the accounting field in the STEM umbrella, and that would open the door for additional federal grant funding to expose K through 12 to accounting and basically do what we all think should be done, and that's kind of marry accounting with those other fields. And so this has really great potential to boost and stimulate the interest in accounting. I jokingly say that I'm bound and determined to make spreadsheets sexy. I know that's a tall task, but I think, in the context of technology applications, I think that can really attract a lot of young people to pursue a field in accounting and pursue their CPA.
I love a good spreadsheet.
Yeah,
I keep a lot of them.
Yeah,
I'm just saying. I guess you have to be a certain type of person though to like appreciate a good spreadsheet.
It's true. Yeah, there are just some professions that you don't even go into that realm of Excel, but they are very, very critical in many other professions, including reporting at times. Let's get a little bit more into why people should care about accounting. You mentioned there's this workforce crisis. You mentioned the role that your office has in just, whether it's investigating fraud, waste, and abuse, or just keeping governments on the up and up about where they're spending their money. It is hard enough to find good people to work at certain places in urban cities, but in smaller and more rural areas as well in New Mexico, if a local government doesn't have an accountant, for instance, that's willing to live in some of these really far-flung communities, why is that a problem for the people that live there?
Well, it's very important. I mean, when I was mayor of Espanola, we had a finance director position, but the job description did not require that individual be a CPA, a certified public accountant. And so that's the situation across the state. So you have folks coming in here, some maybe, they're classified positions, but they're kind of political patronage jobs. So when you have a change in administration, you kind of have the existing finance staff leave, and along with that, their institutional memory. So who takes their place? Someone who's not familiar, with municipal finance in this case, in this example. They're probably not a CPA. They don't understand the requirements of an audit. For example, if any government receives over $750,000 of federal funds, that triggers the need for a single audit. And that single audit is collapsed in a part of the overall annual financial compliance audit. That single audit that involves these federal funds has to be sent to a federal clearinghouse. So it's very important, not just for the accountability of state money, but for the accountability of federal money. And as you know, if a state is non-compliant and is chronically non-compliant and they receive routine federal funds, that could jeopardize their federal funds. So it's very important, really, for to have people at least with an accounting background, with a bachelor's degree in accounting. If you want to apply for a CPA, it's not quite that easy. You need more than a bachelor's. We know that it takes about 120 hours to get your bachelor's, right? But to apply for a CPA, you need 150 hours of higher education. And the additional 30 hours above the 120, there's no requirements for it. I mean, to have a certain percentage in accounting, it could be any courses, but that additional 30 hours represents another year, a master's degree or initial year. And so that is discouraging many young people to attain that additional 30 hours. And so what states like Ohio have done is they passed a law saying, look, you can apply for a CPA in Ohio with only 120 hours of on-transcript credits, and you can apply for an exemption and get credit for the 30 hours through experiential learning outside, off the transcript kind of experience. And so I think that's needed. It's universally seen as one of the primary impediments for people to pursue a CPA.
Yeah. And it feels like the why part of this too, if we recently did a population related episode where we're seeing the more rural places of New Mexico continuing to dwindle in their population. there's obviously a need of funding that comes through grants and whether that's federal or state to go in and sort of help address issues that happen in more rural communities. If they have fewer people, they have a smaller tax base, they kind of get reliant or need that extra boost from grants. But if you can't get an accountant to keep everybody accountable for that money, it sounds like there's no chance that they get more money in the future. That's potentially why this is such a big problem.
That's right. And even the problem is so severe at the small local government level that they don't even have enough staff to segregate duties. For example, you can't have someone who cuts checks and has the same person maybe cash the checks. It has to be this segregation of duties that requires even the involvement of governing body members, non-staff members, to maybe sign. Maybe there's a double signature on a check, and so that's another challenge that we have in some of these rural areas is segregating these duties. That way, we don't have any potential for fraud, waste, and abuse.
Yeah, local checks and balances, I assume,
Exactly.
get really challenging in those situations. I want to give a real life example on a small scale. Just looking around on your website, this is the Office of the State Auditor's website. I searched, one of the audit reports. This one that I was looking at was for the year ending in 2022. Just again, looking at one of the communities that your office had compiled a report on, Elephant Butte. For example, there's an 82-page report that anyone can look at. It's public record. But just skimming through, one of the things that stood out to me was that the auditor noted the city had not paid its gross receipts tax since 2021 and doesn't have the login credentials to pay it. So an entire city didn't pay taxes. Talk to me about that. Are these some of the things that your office is uncovering through these audits in small communities?
There's a number of various standards, and I can tell you that the standards for public accounting are proliferating, and I think that is undermining the profit margin for a lot of these independent public accounting firms. And that's why we see the industry in the form of the number of independent public accounting firms starting to shrink because of the undermining of the profit margin. But in the case of Elephant Butte, we have all kinds of findings. Typically, what the auditor does is there's a standard list of standards that they check for. When they check a multitude of transactions, they'll do what's called testing. They don't have the resources and the time to check all the transactions, but they'll do a testing. And in the case of Elephant Butte, here's like a basic finding that is fundamental to a city of that size, and Elephant Butte has had a history of late audit reports. And so the thing about the audit reports is they give management an opportunity to respond to the finding and identify how they're going to rectify it. Now, a lot of entities promise to rectify it, but somehow that same finding carries over. And so we also track how many findings have been resolved and how many are carryover. And obviously, if you have a chronic carryover findings, that's not good. I think any federal funder would look at that and start wondering, wow, should we continue, especially if it relates to federal funding, should we continue to fund this agency?
And then I'm assuming, you then take a closer look and say, okay, is this malfeasance? Is this just bad bookkeeping? What can you do to further figure out what's going on in these communities?
Well, if the finding is egregious, the management response is insufficient. We typically would write a letter of concern to that agency and say, we want a more detailed plan with milestones in terms of how you're going to rectify this during the course of the next fiscal year. I'll give you an example. General Services Department, they used to manage the health benefit funds for the entire state. They in their, I think their 22 audit, they overspent the health benefits fund to the tune of over $100 million. And that is a violation. You can't, that's a violation of your budget authority. And so it was an audit finding, but we felt like it was egregious enough. We had to send a letter of concern and saying, hey, what specifically are you going to do beyond how you responded in the audit report to address this issue?
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
So I think we touched on this a little bit, but just to kind of further exemplify the situation, when local governments, say, can't keep up with their books, and hypothetically, let's say a legislator or federal government, they award $2 million to a local government for a project, right? And let's say there's no one there keeping good track of how that money gets spent. Why is that a problem for the community, and who can that impact?
That's a great question. A lot of people don't know that there is executive policy in place, and it was retained by the current gubernatorial administration from a previous administration. It's Executive Order 2013-006. What it basically says is if you're not current on your audits, you cannot access your capital outlay if you've been awarded capital outlay. And it also says even if you are on time with your audit, but if the findings collectively represent significant deficiencies and material weaknesses, the Department of Finance and Administration, they're the ones that make the call. They're the enforcer. My agency has a duty to inform. But this is very serious in that if you're not current or you have troubling audits, you can't access your capital outlay. You can't apply for new funding through, for example, the New Mexico Finance Authority. Small local public bodies, ASECIAs, there's an ASECIA infrastructure fund that's administered by the Interstate Stream Commission. They require audit compliance, and they ask our office to certify whether this ASECIA applicant is current on their audits. And that's a precondition to applying for this infrastructure fund. So this is really serious, and that's the only real incentive that we have. And that's why we're pursuing and pushing for that to be state law, to codify and transform executive policy, which doesn't carry the force of law, and make it state law.
So if you don't have somebody tracking this money, how public money is being spent, it sounds like, to boil it down, capital outlay, if you can't access it, you can't complete said infrastructure project or update your water quality. This could impact potentially tourism, water quality in communities, things like that real consumers will start to notice.
Exactly. In fact, I'll give you just a few real world examples where our office intervention has turned institutions around. We were asked by the Higher Education Department and the legislature to conduct the audits of Mesa Lands Community College. It's a community college in Tucumcari. They were about 18 months behind in reconciling their transactions. A previous administration had made a number of decisions that basically put it on the brink of insolvency. And so we went ahead and stepped in, and we did the audits for fiscal year 22 and 23. And the fiscal year 22 audit was a disclaimed audit. That's the worst possible audit you can have. And so, and since then, there's been a complete change in leadership in Mesa Lands. But we've also just finished the 23 audit, which is going to be a better opinion for it. So we've kind of stabilized it through auditing. Enrollment is kind of picking up. Federal funds are no longer in jeopardy. The curriculum is being developed. And so here's a clear example where our intervention has basically turned it around. There was legislators that were basically marketing Mesa Lands to other regional higher ed institutions to say, hey, are you interested in taking over this troubled community college? But, it's got an incredible curriculum of renewable energy and nursing. And so here's an example of a real world difference that my office is making.
The school could have been essentially bought or shut down.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It was very close.
Wow.
Very close.
It really seems like bad accounting can really affect essentially the survival or the continual growth of quality of life in a lot of these rural communities that count on things like capital outlay, which, to be clear, capital outlay is basically money from the state to do improvement projects. In Albuquerque, just a couple examples, capital outlay led to a lot of the changes they've made at the rail yards, which need we remind people was essentially a gated off property for a decade. So a real quality of life example of investments where they mean things to communities. So.
Well, we've taken an interest in these small local public bodies. These are bodies that have revenues under $500,000. And if you look at the Audit Act, they're subject to a kind of a tiered classification depending on their revenue levels and the progress that they've made in obligating their capital outlay. But here's the thing is that this office historically would help them. They'd set aside about $20,000 and they'd put out a call for financial assistance applications. And so we would sign grants not to exceed a couple of thousand, and that would enable them to hire an accountant to do a 1 fiscal year financial compliance. And the problem is these small local public bodies have gone deeper and deeper into arrears in their financial certifications. So we launched a program at the outset of my administration to help them and accelerate this direct assistance, not just through these individual small grants, but through more centralized procurement on a broader geographic scale. And fast forward to today, we've received $1.5 million in state appropriations. At the outset, we identified about 2,000 financial certifications by these small local public bodies that was in arrears. We've got that down to 1,700. But we're kind of evolving kind of our way of making it attractive to the accounting industry because I've already mentioned how contracted it is. And so we kind of started with these smaller procurements on a county-by-county basis. Now we went statewide, and we just awarded 3 major contracts with big accounting firms to address the need for assistance to these small local public bodies. And we're focusing on the bodies that have capital outlay withheld first. But there's a lot of others that don't have capital outlay that still are not in financial compliance. So we're helping the little guy.
It's a triage effort, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Yeah. We saw a big shift in industries during the pandemic when a lot of us had to start working remotely or, work digital, turn our work. Now there's AI. You mentioned people are still working, I think, to figure out how to incorporate or adapt this technology shift in society into their own work. Tell me about how that's played a role in your work in accounting.
Well, we've been very cautious and deliberate in integrating AI into our day-to-day business, but we have, and there are certain limitations of what we can do. But what I've done is I've challenged my IT department to identify any technologies, and this includes commercial off-the-shelf software programs. Because, accounting, you deal with a lot of repetitive tasks, and, these new technologies can really assist in saving time because it's repetitive, it's time intensive. And so we are in the process of integrating technologies in my office to save time and effort. And I want to demonstrate to the legislature that I am doing everything I can to optimize and streamline our processes and operations before I ask for any kind of expansion. Expansion's a bad word in the state legislature, but we are at the front end of this effort to integrate applications in accounting, and it's already happening in the private sector. I would say in general, we're probably a little behind, but I want to catch up. I'm an engineer. I try not to geek out, but I think there are many opportunities for us to apply technology in our day-to-day operations.
Do you see that technological shift that happened contributing to the workplace crisis, like older people leaving the profession and younger people may not being interested?
Well, I think we're missing the opportunity because of this transition that came out of the pandemic. And that's my whole point, is that we can't keep doing things the same old way, right? The traditional accounting, it's in the past. The future is about integrating technology and accounting and making it more attractive, because it is attractive. It's not smoke and mirrors. I mean, there are real world applications. And then there's other, aspects of accounting like fraud examination. I just got my certification as a fraud examiner, and it was very difficult. So I am a CFE, and now I've acquired this professional skepticism in that whenever you look at financial information, you assume that there's something there and you need to find it. And so it changed my whole mindset about how I see finances and audit reports and fraud examinations. So the future looks bright right now, but we need to seize these opportunities. And that's where we need Congress's help to usher in the inclusion of accounting in STEM. We need higher ed to make the learning experience better and more engaging. We need to assure these prospective accounting majors that, you know what, we're reforming the salaries. We know that we need to increase starting salaries. We need to assure them that there's more of a work-life balance, because that's what people want since the pandemic. Nobody wants to commute. I mean, that's a real challenge right now. And so we need to adapt, and we need to be much more nimble. And I'll say my agency, I mean, some folks are kind of like I'm pulling them, but I'm bound and determined to really get there and try and establish some level of parity with the private sector in terms of applying technology and streamlining our operation.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
I find this conversation's been fascinating on a couple levels. Not only like what your office is actually doing, but I also just think about the politics of all of this in this office before. You're applying a very a technical set of goals and also outlining some very specific problems to us. It's not always the way the state auditor's office has been in New Mexico. I just think of at least the last 3 auditors, right? Or even 4. I think of Hector Balderas, who went on to be the Attorney General, Tim Keller, who's now Albuquerque's mayor, Wayne Johnson filled in for a little bit of that term. He has also continued his role in politics and working in different county positions. And then you as well, Brian Colon, who a longtime fixture in the Democratic Party, ran for the New Mexico Attorney General's office, is now as a prominent attorney in the Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon, the whole government funding and how that's playing out there. So I bring those up and thinking that, the conversation that we're having is very into the idea of just the problems and why they need to be addressed technically. And so I guess that brings me to you is, this is your first term. It feels like a different approach. We haven't seen the big press conferences where you're talking about special audits, and it's really, again, been pretty technical. How do you look at this job? Is this a springboard for other office? Or, the sense I've gotten from you is that you are really interested in figuring out these really technical issues that have very dramatic circumstances or dramatic effect that can play out like in New Mexico.
I am. I'm completely vested and all into really making the Office of the State Auditor a model state agency. I'll say in general, I think many aspects of the office's operation has been neglected for quite a while. And, what any leader does when they start, they look inward. And we have been doing a comprehensive assessment of how things are working, what's not working, what changes need to be made. We have made incredible enhancements into our online platform in which we accept information from accounting firms and public entities. It's called OSA Connect. We've reorganized the office. I've created an administrative services division. We expanded our IT department because the IT infrastructure was outdated. We had servers that were maxed out in terms of memory. So these are just the fundamental things that we're doing. We're turning over all the rocks, but I think now we have the right team. We're really on track to really optimize the operation of the office. And so now we can start looking at other areas like helping to reform the industry and call attention to the accounting shortage, embracing this new technology and really being a model in terms of integrating it. Because if I'm not integrating technology, how can I ask the industry to do it? So I see myself as a model, and I need to be an example. And it's frustrating. The wheels of state government turn very slow, and it can be frustrating, but it's the way it is. But I see myself as a catalyst for positive change and reform, not just in my office, but in the industry as a whole. In terms of my political ambitions, I mean, I this office has been used as a stepping stone in the past. And when I campaigned, I assured folks that I wasn't going to do that, I go in every day. I'm involved in all personnel decisions. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a micromanager, but I think it's important for me to attract the right talent. And I think we've succeeded in doing that. My office, I have 2 former state controllers. One's my deputy and one's my financial audit division director. That office has never had that kind of firepower and experience. We have one of the foremost tax policy experts as my compliance and quality control director. So I'm really proud of how we've been very aggressive in, I've done my share of poaching, but attracting talent. And one thing about my office is division directors are they're not exempt. They don't serve at the will of the auditor. They're classified. They're protected. That way, when you have changes in administration, the operations remain stable. And that's what's expected by the industry, because my office has to go through a triennial review. Our last review, we had a due pass. It's very important, and we're audited too, just like every other state agency. So we're not exempt in any way, shape, or form. In fact, we're subject to more scrutiny by the industry.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything we haven't asked you that you feel like is important for people to understand better, or anything else you want to add?
Well, one thing I want to tell folks out there, if you're interested in numbers and math, there's a promising career in the field of accounting. And I've already met with all the accounting departments and all the flagship universities, but I'm going to do another round of meeting. I'd like to convene kind of a summit with all the stakeholders, higher ed, representatives from public entities, New Mexico counties, New Mexico Municipal League, the School Board Association. I want to get everybody in a room and figure out what we can do to boost the industry, because, again, managing our free market economy, I think, in my opinion, is in jeopardy because of this workforce crisis. And I want the legislature to consider a number of other incentives and treat this crisis like they do for the nursing crisis, for lack of law enforcement and correctional officers. There's the lack of high-level operators of water and wastewater systems. I want to bring this accounting workforce crisis into the fore.
Yeah.
All right.
Fascinating.
Well, State Auditor Joseph Maestas, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Again, thanks to Auditor Joseph Maestas for joining us here for this conversation. It is really interesting to hear just his take on the work of the auditor's office, because at least I can say in my career, looking back at all the auditors, a lot of the work that they focused on seemingly was the special work, the special audits that they did when there were financial problems at specific institutions. We really got a holistic picture of why auditing across many different platforms, why it matters. So
yeah, I know one friend who is an accountant, and he's had actually a really great career and a lot of opportunities, and it seems like, that profession is definitely needed. So for any of you guys interested in math and spreadsheets, it sounds like there is work for you. So if you guys have any story ideas or people you'd like to hear from on our show, always feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV, also chris.mckee@krqe.com. And don't forget, if you're watching on Fox New Mexico, this has been an abbreviated conversation. You can watch our entire podcast on krqe.com/podcasts. Thanks for watching and listening.